Good evening or afternoon or even morning, depending on where you are tuning in from. My name is Sydney Yeager, and I'm the Senior Public Programs Producer here at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I'm so pleased to welcome you to today's book talk on The Director. Here at the museum, we are dedicated to the crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate and anti-Semitism, stories of resistance against injustice, and more. Thank you so much for joining us today virtually. We hope that if you're able to, you will visit the museum in person to see our current and upcoming exhibitions, including Art of Freedom, the life and work of Arthur Szyk, which is opening on December 7th, 2025. Closed captions are available on today's program, and instructions on how to turn captions on or off are posted in the chat. If you have questions for our speakers during the program, please put them in the Zoom Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the hour. So again, that's the Zoom Q&A box and not the chat. Today, we are honored to be joined by Daniel Kehlmann and Richard Solomon. Daniel was born in Munich in 1975. His novels and plays have won numerous prizes, including the Candide Prize, the Doderer Prize, the Kleist Prize, the Welt Literature Prize, and the Thomas Mann Prize. His novel Till was shortlisted for the 2020 International Booker Prize, and Measuring the World has been translated into more than 40 languages and is one of the biggest successes in post-war German literature. He currently lives in Berlin and New York. Richard is the founder and CEO of Vantage Point Consultants, which advises corporations on ways to optimize the expenditure of legal dollars and has worked with over 400 of the Fortune 500. He is a senior fellow and member of the advisory board of the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, a co-founder, member of the executive committee and the board of directors of the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center, a member of the advisory board of Gary Kasparov's Renew Democracy Initiative, a member of the Hagel Leadership Council of the University of Chicago Project on Security and Threats, and a member of the advisory board for the Visas of Life Foundation. He previously served on the board of New York University's of Many Institute and the President's Council of the Interfaith Youth Corps. He has also organized and moderated many events with the 92nd Street Y, the Temple Emmanuel Streicher Center, the Illinois Holocaust Museum, the Museum of Jewish Heritage, the Common Good, and many other venerable institutions. And you can purchase The Director at the link in the chat. So thank you so much for joining us. And now I'm going to hand things over to Daniel and Richard.
Thank you very much, Sydney, and it's a pleasure. And Daniel, thank you for your longevity. I know, are in Madrid right now, so it's past 1 in the morning. So thank you for doing this. And I also highly recommend the book. It has gotten wonderful reviews, as we'll get into. With regard to, let me start by asking you, how did you get interested in the subject matter, and what drew you to G.W. Pabst, who was a gifted Austrian-German filmmaker and cinematographer who did very well directing others, but as we learn in the book, had some difficult managing elements of his own life?
Yes. Hi. Good evening. It's great to talk to you at this late hour over here, but it's very energizing, and I'm very happy to stay awake a bit longer for this. I wrote about Pabst chose him as the main character of a novel for one reason only, which is the very strange kind of really turned on its head story of his emigration from Nazi Germany. He was in France when, or I should say, this immigration from Nazi Germany, which then turned out not to be an immigration. He was in France when the Nazis came to power. He had nothing to do, he had no sympathy for the Nazis. He was generally called the Red Pabst. That was his kind of official nickname in the movie industry, because he was a leftist filmmaker of socially relevant, social realistic movies about poor people and inequality of wealth, and actually, yeah, of all the great filmmakers, he had the strongest agenda of social justice. And so he was clearly an enemy of the Nazis and the Nazi Party. And he went to Hollywood. Other than most refugees, he had it very easy to get there because he was one of the world's most renowned directors. So Hollywood wanted him, or at first they thought they wanted him, but then the studio system kind of got in the way and gave him one film to make. He couldn't choose the script, he couldn't choose the actress, he couldn't even edit his own film. And it all turned out terribly because afterwards he was made responsible and considered by the studio system to be guilty for having produced this flop that he never wanted to make. And then something really unparalleled happened. And we can talk in more detail about how it happened. It's kind of unclear. We know a few things about it, but it's mostly unclear. But he turned around and went back first to France, and then from France to Switzerland, and then from Switzerland to Austria, which wasn't called Austria anymore. It was part of the Deutsche Reich. And then the war broke out, and he was, as he later claimed, trapped there. It's one of the things that are a little bit unclear because the border to Switzerland was actually not shut tight. But so he was in Austria and ended up making films for the Nazis. Because every film that you made in the Third Reich was a film for the Ministry of Propaganda because all the movie production companies were nationalized. And to make the whole crazy situation even more strange, we have two of those films. The third one disappeared in the chaos of the last weeks of the war in Prague. And at least one of those movies is actually not bad. They were not propaganda films, and they were actually better films in artistic terms, not great films, but better films than most of what was produced in the same time in Hollywood. And so there are so many weird and strange and crazy ironic twists to this story that I thought I want to write about that. And I want to write a novel about that. And so, yeah, that was the one and only reason. I mean, I really appreciate his work. I think he's a very interesting director, especially in the 20s. But none of those things would have compelled me to write about him. It's about his making it to Hollywood and turning around and coming back into the darkness.
Indeed, and I think we'll get into it more, the whole moral compromise issue, the moral duty of an artist, the quandaries he faced. It also, I think you would agree, has relevance to our own times, whether it's law firms or universities or the C-suite of corporations, which is something else we'll get into. But let me start by asking another question. How do you explain, and this is only an embarrassment of riches, that you have such odd bedfellows as the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, who both call the book brilliant, and Stephen Colbert made it his book of the month in July? It's obviously timely. Any thoughts on that?
It's very timely, apparently. And I have to say, I didn't plan it to be timely. I wrote it, I finished it. I actually already published it 2 years ago in German. Actually pretty exactly two years ago, which means I wrote it definitely. I finished it about 3 years ago. And so I didn't plan it to be relevant in the way it's perceived as relevant right now. I wrote it in what now feels like a different world, which is, I mean, I can be very clear about that, which is the world when we all thought, or most of us thought, or at least I thought, that Trump would never come back and that this nightmare would be over. So I was not writing about the Third Reich or a dictatorship or moral compromise as something that was intended as a commentary about what's happening now in historic disguise or in historic costume, so to speak. I was really fascinated in the real details about what everyday life in the Third Reich was like, how it was, what it must have been like to make a film, um, to be in a nursery, old people's nursery home, to be in a book club, to go to school in a more or less regular class in the country, in a school in the countryside. So I was really interested in getting these things about everyday life in a terrible dictatorship as right as possible. And so the interesting thing now to me, and it's not just in America that the book is perceived as timely. For example, I had amazing reactions from Hungary, where it was perceived as very, very timely, and people reacted very strong to it. The interesting thing to me seems that what is timely and relevant about the book right now, speaking to the current situation in countries where people make moral compromises in a moment where democracy is under threat, it must come from the fact that I was trying to get it exactly right with all my abilities, the way it was back then, to make it as specific as possible, and to not try, I was not trying to write this as a metaphor or as kind of a mirror of what happens today. But this is something I deeply believe in. In literature, the specific is the universal. If you get the details of something really right, then you create something that can be perceived as universal or as timely in completely different situations. And I mean, it's kind of a mixed, I have mixed feelings about this, to be honest. Of course, it is wonderful if you write something and people feel it speaks to them in the situation in which they are now, and to write something that people perceive as relevant. So I'm happy about that. But on the other hand, I cannot be happy about the fact that the world is in the state it is in now. So
Sure.
I would, of course, also really like the book to be not relevant in this way right now.
I hear you. Were you, obviously the book was written in Germany before our last election, but did the AfD, the right-wing party in Germany, affect you in your writing?
Not that I knew of. To be honest, I wasn't too worried about them. Not because they're not terrible. They are really terrible. But I was, and I'm still actually quite confident that they cannot come to power anytime soon. There is a very, very strong social consensus in Germany among the other parties and among the people in not just in culture, the people in culture and and the people running the German economy, all the people of influence, that the AfD is beyond the pale. You do not talk to these people. You do not accept these people into your social circles. And you never vote with them in parliament. So I'm not too worried about that, in at least in the next few years, and that's about as far as we can see right now. And I mean, if I compare that to America, I always feel it's weird how this kind of social stigma does not exist in America, given that one of the two big parties now has become like an openly authoritarian party with at least very strong fascist elements. It's very strange that this kind of social exclusion does not exist. But in Germany, it still does. So German history is still very present in that regard. And so So yeah, I wasn't, and I'm still, maybe I'm wrong about this, but I'm still not too worried about AfD. I'm much more worried about America, about the USA.
Well, we're going to get into it. Let me ask one other side note. You dedicated the book to your most accomplished human rights lawyer wife, Anna, but also to the late Judge Thomas Bergenthal, who was the Justice of the International Court of Justice. Tell us why you did that, if you would.
Tom was a mentor and very close friend of my wife, and she also worked for him for a while, and I had the privilege to get to know him. He was a Holocaust survivor. He was one of the, I think there were only a few children who survived Auschwitz, and he was one of them. And he was in Auschwitz for, I think, 8 months, carrying the Cyclone B cans so he was forced to do that, and that's how he survived. He then survived the Death March, and was one of, I think, only 3 kids who survived. So it was kind of a succession of very unlikely. It was very unlikely, but he survived. I wouldn't want to call it a miracle, because then why would the people who didn't survive not get a miracle like that? But it was kind of a miracle that he survived. And he managed then to write later in life one of the best Holocaust survival memoirs that I've ever read, because he was so invested in justice, in preventing something like that from ever happening again, by his work as a judge on this, for example, the San Salvador Truth Commission, and of course on the International Court for Justice, that he was able to talk about his experiences in a way that was so impressively open. And he seemed to be, I wouldn't dare to really make a judgment on that, but he seemed to be not traumatized. He seemed to be able to remember everything that happened to him and talk about it. And he wrote a book called A Lucky Child, which is really one of the great works of memoirs of the Holocaust. And that's where I come in. I knew, and I interviewed him on stage actually in Nuremberg, in the courtroom where the Nuremberg trials had happened, when my wife was the founding director of the Nuremberg Academy, who kind of was in charge and got to be in charge of that courtroom, which is the place where international criminal justice was kind of born with the Nuremberg trials. So I knew that Tom never wanted to read books about the Third Reich, ever. He said, I was there, that's enough for me. He didn't want to read them. So, and we visited him every year in Washington, and then he moved to Florida to a very good institution where he and his wonderful wife Peggy could be looked after and cared for. And my wife and son visited him, and I wasn't there, and she had the manuscript of my novel in German, actually. It wasn't translated yet, but she had it in German with her, and she was actually reading it. I'd just given it to her. And he said, well, is this, what's that? And she said, that's Daniel's new book, but it's not for you, because we know you don't want to read this kind of book. And he said, and he was close to 90. I said, I think I'm ready now, give it to me. And he took, sorry.
No, you go.
Yeah, he said, I think I'm ready now. And he took it from her. And then she flew back to Europe, and we didn't hear from him. And of course, I was worried. Did he hate it? Did he think it was all wrong? Did he not, did he not like the book? But what had happened was that he had died of COVID. So he died while he was, well, reading the book, not yet a book, a manuscript in German. And that's why I dedicated the book to him. Because, I felt it was just the right thing to do under those circumstances.
Sure. Well, let's talk, since you also live on this side of the ocean, with some of what's going on here. But before we do that, just touch on for a minute, you have these conversations with the Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels. They're likely hypothetical, but that was based on your reading of history at the time and the quandaries and choices that decent people faced, in filmmaking and art forms going back to the Third Reich.
Yes, it's now it's one of the central scenes of the novel is that is when Pabst gets summoned by the minister, as he's called. But for every reader who knows anything, it's clear that it's Joseph Goebbels. And initially, I was surprised that Pabst's name never comes up in Goebbels' diaries. So, and I thought, I knew that Goebbels, one of the things he really liked to do was summoning people to his office and then actually either shouting at them or being deceptively polite and then suddenly putting a lot of pressure on them and treating them, well, he was obviously one of the worst people who ever lived, but he was also a very hands-on movie producer, which is kind of unexpected and interesting. There is a big book, a big study by Philipp Möller called Der Filmminister about Goebbels as a movie producer. And I was always fascinated by that. And so I was pretty sure that it was at least very likely that if someone like Pabst, who's one of the great German directors alive, comes back to Germany, the minister himself will take an interest. And I knew that Goebbels liked to summon people. So I thought, this is enough for me. This is all I need. This is a novel. It's not a biography. So it's absolutely enough for me to think it's possible to then imagine that scene. And I imagined that scene with a lot of detail of Goebbels summoning Pabst and actually forcing him to make amends and telling him, I'm very sorry that I'm a traitor to the Reich and that I worked with Jews and that I worked with communists. And I understand that. So he's doing what was called in the East, was then called Selbstkritik. And again, I'm a novelist, so the fact that's possible is enough for me. But I was very happy to learn later, because from a documentary about Pabst that came out a while after my book, that it actually did happen, that Goebbels actually did summon him. And the version of what I imagined had actually happened. And again, I don't need that to be the case. But I am happy to learn when something like this turns out to be true.
So let's get into, I'm not a neurosurgeon, but we are living in a spineless world in many ways. There's a concept Sydney mentioned, the Illinois Holocaust Museum that I co-founded, about being an upstander, a proactive, positive force for change. I'm going to give you two quotes and ask you to expand your views and enlarge the prism of what's going on in our country here. One quote in the book is, the most important thing is to not stand out. The other is, you have to be extremely careful not to say anything wrong. It's a complete opposite of being a force for change and daring to do what is right. Yet we see today in our society here, when you're on the U.S. side or in New York, where you live, CEOs of companies, Article 1 branch of government, the US Congress, presidents of universities who often are replaced because they seem to have no clear view of things, law firms, too many to name, who are not standing up and who are collaborating or acquiescing or capitulating. Speak to that broader issue.
I'm of course shocked about that, as many of us are, and I'm shocked about the fact that especially the rich and powerful often, and the most powerful and the richest, don't have more dignity. You would think that the one upside, or the main upside of being very rich, is that you're also very independent and that you can actually afford to lose some money just to keep your dignity and your sense of what's right and wrong. And I was not expecting to see what I saw in the US in regard to the rich and powerful being so fearful and so ready to make moral compromises. And what I learned from thinking about Pabst's story, and he was not very rich and he was not powerful, so it was much easier to put pressure on someone like him than on some of the people who we see cave now in the US. But what I learned from his story, and also looking at other people who are working in the German film industry, is that usually the kind of self-justification for moral compromise is to protect something that matters a lot. So it comes to people as, if I don't do this, someone else will be where I am now, and that person will make compromises that are so much worse. And that is not always wrong. That's the terrible thing about this. It's not clear that that's a wrong thought, but in many cases it does lead to terrible results. And my novel is, of course, the story of one man who keeps talking about only art matters and only great art matters. And in a way, the fact that the Nazis give him the opportunity to make films and actually give him more artistic freedom than Hollywood gave him justifies actually working for them and getting in deeper and deeper, because he wants to make good films. And he argues that if I'm not doing this, the world would be exactly the same, but those films wouldn't exist. So the world would be a worse place without my films. And again, it's not entirely ridiculous to say that, but it's still morally wrong. And it's a kind of that famous now used by all people all the time, but still very helpful metaphor of the slippery slope really applies here. It's a slope that you shouldn't even step on, because just making a few steps, you're then sliding. And
exactly, I didn't mean to interrupt, but to use that metaphor, you also can inexorably slide into autocracy, as we can see.
Mm-hmm. As we can see, yes, absolutely, as we can see. And what we also learn from looking at the concrete situation in Nazi Germany is that they were all about overwhelming their opposition, as long as there was still opposition. So they moved incredibly fast. They actually moved even faster than the Trump administration moved in the beginning, because they were all young, very young men, and they had an unbelievable speed. And I mean, the only thing that made me feel a little bit less bad about what I saw and experienced in the US is that I saw that even though they might be trying. They're not moving as fast as the Nazis did. They're just not able to do that. Thank God.
Well, there's no question that there is a lot of acquiescence that occurs here. We do see, however, pockets of resistance because virtually every law firm, without naming them, that have challenged efforts to fell who they represent or how they conduct their operations succeeded. But that requires taking a stand, which is something that can be difficult. Let's turn also for a moment to Hollywood because we have, a few months ago, but you have the issue of Jimmy Kimmel and being taken off the air and issues of freedom of the press. We see it also with steps taken with 60 Minutes, where our daughter worked for many years. Comment on that and, Hollywood's role both in the 1930s and today.
Well, what I found interesting in writing about a director, and that's also why Pabst was not in a very good position to show a lot of restraint and in moral restraint and to show a lot of spine, is that if you're a director, you kind of used to making compromises. You always have to convince people to give you resources for your art, for the art. It's not like a writer or a painter who can just make his art or make their art on their own. You need resources, you need money, you actually need an industry. It's not called movie industry for nothing. It is an industry. So in Hollywood, especially in the 30s and 40s, directors were hired contractors in a way. And they did not have a very strong idea of themselves as artists. And someone like Pabst couldn't deal with that. And someone like Fritz Lang was actually able to bend the system to his will because of his superhuman willpower that he had, but Pabst was not like that. So what I'm trying to say is Hollywood is never and was never a place where you learn morally principled behavior, because you're kind of used to compromising all the time on many fronts. Yeah, so in my book, Pabst starts out, the book starts with him in Hollywood, and you see everyone actually making a lot of compromises all the time. And then, of course, he goes back to Germany, and you see what real terrible moral compromise is. So I'm not equating the two things, definitely not. And I mean, you see so much of that today. You would not, if you would pitch a TV show about the corruption of, let's say, a TV show about corrupt people set in the first Trump administration, there is no way you could get that to be made now. I mean, I was shocked when someone pointed out recently that Taylor Swift, who was so outspoken against Trump and was a Democrat and was endorsing Kamala Harris, that she now refuses to order the Trump people to not use her music on their clips. So and I mean, she's a billionaire. What is she afraid of? And she does not say a word about her music being used on those clips. And I had to think of my book. And I had to think of my book when I saw the last Oscar ceremony. Of course, you had all these people who were so outspoken just 2 years ago, and nobody said a word. And I mean, I went to the Tonys this year. A friend invited us to see the Tonys, and something amazing happened. I mean, it was very cool. The original cast of Hamilton was performing a 4.5-minute medley of Hamilton. And I was thinking, this is this is Lin-Manuel Miranda, who's a genius, and Lin-Manuel Miranda, and I think he will just put in one line, just one line about the fact that America is sliding into autocracy. And it will be very fast, and most people won't notice, but afterwards we will be able to analyze that. And he will show in some way on live television that what's happening here is not okay. Not just did he not do it, instead, he did perform the great song, I'm not throwing away my shot, which is one of the great songs in Hamilton. So he literally, on live television, threw away his shot by performing the song, I'm not throwing away my shot. And I thought, like, this is absolutely unbelievable. He threw away his shot by literally saying that this is what he wouldn't do. And I went home and my head was spinning. I couldn't believe it.
So where are we going to find our role models today? Obviously not in Hollywood and seemingly not in Congress. There are some CEOs who speak out and some presidents of universities who have had moral courage, but it's too few and far between.
It's too few and far between, but we can hope that things will get better. There are many judges who are making very good judgments right now, and who are it's just so far the Supreme Court doesn't seem to appreciate what they're doing, and doesn't and seems intent on making their work much harder, to put it mildly. But the legal profession, actually parts of the legal profession, are doing a very impressive job. And if you ask about role models, I think it's a good moment to look at Eastern European dissidents. And a lot of them are still around. A lot of them have great experience about how to deal with dictatorships. And a lot of some of them are actually in the US. But it's not just Eastern Europeans. So, for example, a lot of great writers who had to leave Turkey are in the US and in Berlin, and you can talk to them. And I just read a book. I just read a book by Ece Temelkuran, a Turkish dissident, called "How to Lose a Country," and she describes exactly step by step on what happened to her country and how she literally lost it. And there's a lot of experience that you can get in regard to the situation the US is in from people from Turkey and Eastern Europe, and of course from Russian dissidents who left Putin's Russia. And I feel like there's this old problem: Americans don't really listen to foreigners, and one should listen to those people.
Well, it's indeed ironic that your wife at this time is at an event that I sit on the board of. The Renew Democracy initiative was mentioned earlier by Gary Kasparov.
Exactly, he's one of those people. Yes, of course.
Yes, and that they are constantly giving heart and soul to the voice of dissidents. So I certainly agree with that. Let's touch on for a second another issue which sort of pervades the book. I'm a first-generation American, about immigrants. I happen to think our country was made by immigrants. And Pabst at one point is asked, he just says, there's a language, I'm a garden variety immigrant. Speak a little about what's going on in the United States today, whether it's ICE or otherwise, with one's status.
United States is something that you can call, actually you can call an asymmetrical dictatorship in a way. Like if you're a white, reasonably wealthy American, meaning owner of an American passport, you're still pretty safe, and you're safe actually. And you can say, what's the problem? People are really exaggerating. This is not a dictatorship at all. And for you, it isn't a dictatorship. if you are an undocumented immigrant, even though you might have been paying taxes and having maybe a small company or have worked in a small company, you are in a situation that's comparable to the situation the Jews were in Germany in 1933, not in 1940, of course, and not in 1944. That was different. But in 1933, Jews were assaulted on the street by Nazi. It was mostly SA at that point, and they were actually put in concentration camps. Like camps like Seacot, for example. It's just not in America, but that's just a local difference. It's not a difference in entity and substance. And every time you left your home and were walking on the street, you were in danger, the same way as you were in danger when you were an undocumented immigrant. And now it has kind of has widened to people who actually have American passports but are Latinos, and they keep getting arrested and keep getting assaulted. And suddenly it turns out it's actually not that easy to prove that you're an American citizen, because many American citizens don't carry physical passports with them or actually have them. So yeah, it's kind of what I would call an asymmetrical dictatorship. Some people are actually in America are in the situation Jews were in 1933, and other people are perfectly safe, and they would say, like, what's the hysteria all about? Because their situation is different.
Yes, I can relate because I lost part of my own family, both in the Holocaust in Poland and on my mother's side in Austria and Vienna, and we have a parallel there. But to your point earlier, the rule of law and the role of the courts as one of the last vanguards of democracy and safeguards, I think is ever more critical. I would be remiss not to mention it. I'm going to just ask a couple of other questions, but turning it over to Sydney and the audience to touch a minute on your background. Your father spent part of his life in Vienna, and you did as well. Your paternal grandfather was Jewish. My mother's side of my family were all bankers in Vienna. Actually, my first cousin twice removed was Hermann Brock, the writer, as you and I have talked about, Death of Virgil and otherwise. So to what extent did that briefly motivate you in also this writing, obviously your past?
Well, what motivated me a lot was my father was born in 1927, and he was it was what the Nazis called a half Jewish family. They had this term half Jew and quarter Jew. My grandparents would have been full Jews in Nazi terms, but because they were born Jewish. But my grandfather managed to get his and his wife's documents forged and changed by some very clever tricks. So he turned himself and his wife into official half Jews. But what I find so amazing is now we know that if you were a half Jew in Vienna, you were probably safe because they did not get to arresting and deporting them. They moved that off to until after the war. But you didn't know that back then. So on behalf of my grandfather, it was just a guess that this might be something that would help. And it turned out to make the family survive. But still, you were subjected to lots of abuse as a Jewish family. So my father went to school until he was expelled from school and had to work in a factory. He was very bad at that. He always claimed that he was so bad at it that the other workers thought he was a Soviet agent, a saboteur, because he was so bad. But they said, "We got your back. It's fine. We're not gonna tell on you." And he said, "I'm not a saboteur." And said, "No, no one can be that inept at what we're doing here." Anyway, then he was in a concentration camp for 3 months, and he survived more or less by chance before the war ended. So I have this connection. In my generation of writers, it's unusual to be a direct child of somebody who was still a direct to be a child of someone who was still a direct victim of the Nazis. But also, my father was a great storyteller, so he talked a lot about the small things, what it was like to go to school under the Nazis, what it was like to come home and see the neighbors, the neighboring family, father and mother, call each other out of the window with Heil Hitler Mom, Heil Hitler Dad, and things like he thought that was all hilarious in a way. He loved to talk about the hilarious absurdity of everyday life under the Nazis. And I used a lot of his stories in the book, especially about Pabst's son going to school in Nazi Germany. So so it was really a lot of, that's why it didn't feel to me like writing a historical novel. I have written historical novels, but this was for me a novel that was very close to well, close to things that happened to my father. There are also in a scene in Paris where Pabst is meeting exiled writers before he goes back. There is Karl Zuckmayer in it, who was a friend of my father. There's Walter Mehring, whom my mother, who's still alive and well, thank God, she remembers Walter Mehring very well. So these are people who are, in a way, at least in my own family background, I feel close to. So it wasn't like writing a well-researched historical novel about the 30 Years' War, which I did before. It felt profoundly different.
I hear you. I want to underline a point you made and then launch into my last question, which is that small compromises can lead to barbarianism. You have that word phrase in the book, but it also, as we say in our museum, can also lead to genocide. You know, it's just on a continuum. So I'd like to end my part before I turn it over to Sydney for the audience. We've had a lot of, you know, sort of depressing downer comments. You also have a quote in the book, "All this will pass, but art remains." And you can touch on that if you wish. But I want to ask you, and I'll give you my own take before I have you answer, what gives you hope on the other side? You know, in my own case, I'm going to say, as I told you before we came on live, that I want to dedicate my part of this program, and I want to thank you for doing it, to our second granddaughter, who was born yesterday, Ella Louise Solomon, who I got to see today for the first time. And looking into her eyes, I see hope and possibility in the youngest generation. But Daniel, what gives you hope given the, you know, thorny subjects we discussed and the concerns of the damage being done on a daily basis?
First, congratulations to your granddaughter. That's wonderful. What gives me hope is actually something much more prosaic. I'm going to give a much more prosaic answer than your beautiful answer about your granddaughter. The voters. There were just 3 really major wins for the Democrats. And it's actually, lots of people are kind of going the easy way of pessimism by saying, oh, but they're gonna manipulate those elections and he will stay in power forever. And it is true that they will try to manipulate elections, but it is very hard to do that. Orban has now been in power for a very, very long time. And I just talked to somebody who talked to Orban, and he's terrified about losing the next election, which he probably will. So even Orban, after all these years in power, couldn't just fix elections and win and pretend to win them and run away with them. So it's not that easy to do that. And that, together with the fact that the Trump is really not looking great, that his polls are not looking great, and that the Democrats just had these 3 wonderful big wins on the same day, I have some faith in the voters. The voters got us into this mess, it has to be said, but they might get us out of it.
On that note, Sydney, although I have other questions I could certainly pose to Daniel, why don't I let you ask some audience questions? But thank you for my part, Daniel. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I want to thank you both also before we go into audience questions for that really great discussion. And for anyone in the audience, feel free to continue putting questions in and we'll get to as many as we can. So we've had a few people ask this question, so I'm going to combine it for time. But can you talk about the translation process for your book? Like you mentioned, you're promoting the Spanish translation. So what was that process like, and what are some of the differences that you've observed between the different versions?
I work very closely with my English translator, and that's the only translator I can have a really close work relationship with because it's the only language I speak reasonably well. There's not much I can offer and I can contribute to the process for the Spanish and the French translation. But I can look at the English translation and at least tell Ross Benjamin, my wonderful translator, what I think about it, and I can ask him questions and he asks me questions, and we have a very so when he's working on a translation, I make it an absolute priority, shooting off these short emails to me, and I'm answering very fast. I make it a priority, whatever I'm doing. If there's a question from Ross, I'm going to answer. There was also an additional thing with the English translation, because there is one chapter that has a different narrator, and that's narrated by a British writer who happens to be in a little bit of a similar situation as Pabst. A British comic writer who was arrested by the Nazis in Belgium and is now held at the Adlon as a prisoner of war and forced to write broadcasts that the Nazis are broadcasting via Calais to Great Britain. So it's very closely, he's very closely modeled on P.G. Wodehouse. And because all this happened to P.G. Wodehouse. And I was writing, obviously, the book in German, and I felt I do not have to try, and I wouldn't dare try to copy or emulate P.G. Wodehouse style, because he's one of the greatest stylists ever, in my opinion. And I couldn't do that. I would not be able to do that. And again, in German, because it's one language removed, or in any other language other than English, I don't even have to try that, because the only thing it has to sound like is maybe a translation from P.G. Wodehouse, but it doesn't have to sound like Wodehouse. So in English, that didn't quite work. So some friends, some British writer friends, especially with a perfect ear for British English, said to me, if with the verbatim translation, this doesn't work, because it just sounds as if you would have tried to write like Wodehouse, but it doesn't sound like Wodehouse. So so we had a very interesting process. My editor, Lawrence Stein, whom I got to help me edit the book, he's one of the great American editors, and Ross Benjamin and me, we were really looking at every sentence, and especially with Lauren's help, we're rewriting this so that it actually does sound like Wodehouse, but not the Wodehouse from the Bertie Wooster stories, like the Wodehouse from the interviews. That was Lauren's amazing idea. And so there's one chapter now that's really profoundly different. Not profoundly, it's not like stuff happens in it now in English and not in the other versions, but it does read really different than it does read in the other languages because of that Wodehouse problem, which I think we solved very well. So at least no one complained about that chapter. And my British writer friends all said, yeah, now it's much better. So that was a very interesting part of the process, and a very unusual problem to have.
You, I think, have it in 15 different languages already. Sydney, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think we have time for one more question, so I apologize if we weren't able to get to everyone's, but What role do you think art can play in the world today?
I think the their arts are really very different from each other, different kinds of art. So music will always play a completely different role from theater or novels or film. I will actually speak to what I think novels can still do better than any other form of art. Novels are a school of empathy. In a novel, you really feel, you look through the eyes of another person, or several, or lots of them, literary characters. You think another person's thoughts. Films can't do that, because in films you look at people from the outside, but in a novel you are looking out into the world from the head of someone else, and you think someone else's thoughts, and you feel some, if it works well, you feel someone else's emotions. And so in a way, novels have always been a school of empathy, a school of not rejecting or hating other people, but to understand the common core of humanity, I don't know how to phrase it differently. So I think, I mean, less people are reading novels now than 10 years ago. And 10 years ago, people read novels less than another 10 years ago. So it's definitely declining, but there is still a considerable readership for novels. And I think this is something that only novels can do to this extent, teaching us empathy. And that's something, of course, very necessary now and ever.
And I certainly, for one, hope you'll continue writing, my friend.
Thank you so much. Thank you.